Everyone, I know a lot of you are using Next.js to build some kind of AI app or other apps that have some type of task that takes a bit longer. For example, if you make an API call to an AI provider, that may take a couple minutes. If you're using the latest models, they may think for multiple minutes. Or maybe you want to run something on a schedule. Maybe every couple hours you want to do something, or once a day. And what I'm getting at is that there are certain things that we want to do in our apps, in our software, that do not fit in nicely in a request response cycle that we're used to. So for example, in a Next.js application like this, it's all about a very fast request and response cycle. So the user's browser, the client, will make requests to our server side. Maybe they're navigating to a new page. That's typically a server component. So the server component needs to be rendered and then gets sent back to the client. Or maybe the user is updating some data. These days, we typically use server actions for that. Server action may return a response. Or maybe you are using a route handler, an API endpoint on your server, and it's doing something and it returns a response. Right? So Next.js is one app here, and it's centered around this very fast request response cycle, maybe a second or 2 seconds. And if it's really a bit longer, maybe multiple seconds, but it's pretty rare to have something take, I don't know, a minute or 2 minutes. But of course, if you build anything that's a little bit more sophisticated, you will have those tasks at some point, and maybe you've already run into that. I was building a startup that allowed users to create videos. So a user basically has to collect a bunch of material for the video, maybe some images, some text, some audio, and then a video has to be rendered into an MP4 file, let's say. Right, so that video rendering, the user may click on a button on the web app. They may click on render video. Right? And that will send a request to my server side. And now my server side knows, okay, we need to render a video, but rendering a video may take a long time, may take 10 or 20 minutes. Right? So we could not just wait until it was finished and then send a response. That was a type of task that we have to do basically outside this traditional request response cycle. We have to sort of run it in the background. Right? So Next.js is often hosted on these serverless functions, Lambda functions. And we do not want to just wait 30 minutes, let's say, because you're going to pay for 30 minutes of function invocation, perhaps. But basically, the way that Next.js is typically hosted and built, you will run into an issue when you have long-running tasks like this. But it's the same when you have some kind of scheduler necessity, maybe cron jobs, right? Maybe I want to send the user an email once a month or once a week. Right? This is also not something that fits into this request response cycle. Now, especially these days with AI, you're going to have a lot more of these long-running tasks because you want to use the latest models and they just may take a little bit longer. So just as an example, let's say I have some kind of AI text summarizer app. So a user can just paste a bunch of text here and maybe give their email. And then when they click summarize, we want to take their huge body of text potentially, and we want to use AI to nicely summarize that. Right? So that may take, let's say, 2 minutes or maybe even longer if the requirements are even more sophisticated. So it may take a long time, but we also may get a lot of people submitting these requests. So we may want to prioritize, let's say, paying users. So those tasks should be prioritized. So you get more like a queue system. And so whenever you get a little bit more sophisticated with your apps, you will run into these issues. So actually, I want to introduce you to Inngest. They are also today's sponsor. And I think they fit in really nicely in this Next.js stack, especially if you're using these AI workloads. But even without, they solve this problem that you have where you need to run things outside the normal mechanics of a Next.js app. And basically they allow us to easily add some kind of queuing system to our Next.js setup or cron jobs, basically turn it into a more event-driven workflow. So let me actually show you how this would work in this text summarizer app. What I'm doing here is we have this homepage here with the form, right? So this is where users can add the text. They have like a bunch of text and also, let's say, an email, so that when it's finished, we will actually send the summary to their email. So it's just a very basic form, nothing fancy here, although I am using a so-called server action. So when the user submits the form, we will receive it here on our server side in Next.js. Okay, and now we have this issue, right? So we will get it onto our server side, and now we may have an issue because this may potentially take a long time, right? So you can imagine these AI workloads or other workloads, video rendering, they just may take a long time, right? So we cannot just leave the client hanging. So we have to create perhaps some kind of queue system. And if you ever try to do that, it's actually quite painful. I try to do it with the video rendering startup, and I remember how much of a mess it was to try to do that. So I'm going to use Inngest now. So the way to think of it is a separate server that we can hand that off to. Right, so I'm going to have some kind of Inngest instance here, let Inngest manage it. So I will install Inngest right here, and then I can run a local Inngest instance so we can work with Inngest during development here. I will run it right here. I will install that, yes. All right, so now we have the Inngest dev server running. Now you get a nice dashboard out of the box actually. So if I open that up, you can see I now have the dev server here running on my own computer, and it will give you insights into these workloads that we're gonna run. Right now I don't have anything, so it's just gonna be empty here, but this will come in really handy in a second. Okay, so I have this running now. So what I have now is basically that Inngest server. This is now running. So I now want to be able to communicate between my Next.js server side and Inngest. So I will create an Inngest folder here to instantiate the client so that my Next.js app communicate with that Inngest server. I will just call that ingest.ts. So here I can instantiate Inngest. It's very basic. We're just going to say, yeah, here we have a summarizer app. I'm going to create functions here for Inngest, and Inngest will then trigger those functions. So I will just call that functions here. So this is the function that I want to run, right? So the user will submit some text, and we want to create a summary out of that and also send an email with the result to the user. I'm going to put that in a function. So I use that Inngest client to create a function. Here in the first argument, I'm going to give it an ID and a name. With Inngest, we can trigger this function when there is an event. So it becomes an event-driven workflow. So if the user submits text, we're going to fire off an event, right? So the event, and we're going to call it a text /summary.requested event. When that event occurs, when Inngest receives an event like that, we're going to run this function. So this is the actual meat of it, you could say. This is where we're actually going to do the summary. Okay, so to actually summarize it, we need to know the actual text that the user submitted. So we will get that here as the event. Okay, so here we get the text that the user actually submitted. And we're just going to do something silly here just to see how all of this works, the mechanics of it. It's just gonna get some words and conjure up some kind of summary. We're just gonna add a set timeout here just to pretend it's gonna take a little bit longer, because typically we're gonna invoke AI, right? I'll show you that in a second. But just to get a sense of the mechanics here, this is what we have right now. Ultimately, we're going to return that summary as the result here. So this is an Inngest function. So we want to run this, and we do that by sending an event to Inngest. So then Inngest knows, oh yeah, so now we have to run the function that corresponds to that event. And that is basically what we want to do inside here in our Next.js app server action, because it doesn't fit in nicely in that request response cycle. We want to run this in the background, you could say, as more like a queue type of system. So we need to send this event to Inngest so it knows to trigger the function. So when the user fills out the text here and their email, and they're going to click on summarize, we're going to receive that here in a Next.js server action on our server side. We're going to grab the text and the email, and then we want to trigger this function here with Inngest that we just set up. So we need to use the event name. So we used this event name when setting up the function. So here I'm going to send this event to Inngest. And of course, to run that function, it needs to know what the text actually is. That's what we sent along as data here, the text and also the user email. We'll use that in a second. So that is then what the function will receive here in the event, right? So that's how we get the text here. So basically what we're doing here is the Next.js server side here is sending an event to Inngest, and then Inngest will trigger this function. This function will still run on in our own app, by the way. So Inngest is not going to run this function for us on their hardware. It will still be part of our own app. So this will still run inside our own app. It's just that we manage the workflow with Inngest. Right? So Inngest needs to know these functions that we will have on our server side, so it can then trigger them. So we do need to add one more thing here, which is an API route here. So I'm going to call it /API/ingest. And I need to expose some API endpoints here so the Inngest server can communicate with my app and discover the functions that it may need to trigger. That's what we do with serve here. So it needs to get the actual functions here. So we do need to export those here. We may have multiple functions. So I'm actually going to export it as an array. I'm going to call that functions here. So actually we can remove this and just export it like this. So now you can see everything is wired up. Our Inngest dev server will be able to hook into these API endpoints on our server side to discover the functions, and then we can submit an event. Basically, we will submit an event to Inngest, and then Inngest will decide which functions to trigger. So by the way, now you can also see my Next.js server is receiving these requests from the Inngest dev server. So Inngest has now discovered the functions that it can trigger. So let's actually try it out now. I just copied some text here from the Inngest documentation. The actual result here is not important for now, just to see how all of this works. I just added an email here. So let's actually see what happens if I click now. Okay, so I clicked. The form is reset. So where can I now see what happened? Well, now we can go to our dev server here, the dashboard here that we get, and we see that we now have one run, as it's called. So this function that we created was triggered properly because this is the event that we sent. And so Inngest triggered this function to run. And if I click on that, we can see we have we can see the tracing here. You can see that it was queued at some point and it has some duration. We can see the input to the function, so the actual data that we sent along to the function. You can see the text and the email, and also the output here, right? So here you can see ultimately it produced a summary with, ultimately it produced some summary here. Right, so this was one run. Now actually what I can do from the dashboard, I can run it again if I want. Right, so now you can see when I click here, it sort of takes a little bit and then it's finished. We can see a lot here in the dashboard. It's actually really nice. Right, so here we can see all the runs. So we submit an event, we'll trigger a function. We can see the observability into those runs, right? Really nice. And here are the functions that Inngest has discovered. So you can also see all of that. You can also manually invoke them here from the dashboard. Right, so you create functions and then you run them. So the actual runs of them is what we see here. All right, now what are the benefits of doing all of this? Well, first of all, we get a lot of these queue system type of benefits. So for example, if a lot of users are submitting these requests to summarize their text, we may want to prioritize some of these runs ahead of others. So for example, if the user is on an enterprise plan, we may want to prioritize that. Or simply if the user is a paying member, right, on the pro plan, we want to prioritize their submission in front of the others. We may also want to rate limit it. So for example, a particular user can only submit 5 in 1 hour, right? So here we can say every 1 hour, the limit is 5. It is per user ID, right? So when we send that event to Inngest, we can also specify a user ID here. So then it knows that, oh, for that particular user ID, we have to limit it. We also get controls for concurrency and throttling and other ones as well. The other big benefits here that we get, let's actually go here to the actual implementation of the function, where we actually compute the result for the user. We can actually make this much more robust. So let's actually do something else here. Inngest also gives us so-called steps. So you can think of this workflow as a series of steps, because what we just did was only summarizing it, but we also then want to send an email to the user with the result. That's another step, you could say. And maybe 1 week later, let's say, we want to send another email to the user with maybe a request, maybe asking them to review the result that they got, right? So there is a series of steps that we want to run in response to that event. So actually what we just did is just the first step. So what we can do is, instead of having a plain function like that, we will use this step variable here. So we're going to split up the workflow here into steps. So what you do is, well, for step 1, we have step.run. We can call it summarize the text, right? So we just use some simple algorithm here just to try it out. We'll use AI in a second. We will get a result here, and that is the summary, right? That's step 1. And then the second step, maybe actually to store it in a database. We may want to create some record in our database with the original text and then the actual summary of that. It may take some time just to simulate it here. And I may want to use Prisma or Drizzle or some other ORM to insert it into my database. And that's another step. And then we may want to send the result to the user via the email that they submitted as well, the user email that we got here, right? Maybe you're using some third-party provider for the email. You can do that in here. And then we actually want to wait a little bit. Let's say we want to wait 4 days. We can use step.sleep here with Inngest, schedule essentially a task to run after some time. And this can be also much shorter, can be an hour or 30 minutes, can actually be a year as well. Before we continue here, we want to wait some time. And then after those 4 days, we want to send the review, right? So now 5 steps here, and there are many benefits that we get from doing it this way with Inngest. So now let's say that sending this email, this one here, Let's say something goes wrong here. Maybe our email provider is returning some error, right? Or maybe some error is being thrown here. Inngest can automatically retry that. And when it retries this, it's not going to run all of this again, because it can memorize that it has already run these steps. And so it can just go back here where we left off and go from here again, right? So this is one function still, this one function, but with steps, we can sort of break it up into checkpoints. So once we have done this, we don't have to rerun that again when something goes wrong here later. This is really important because, of course, once we have already summarized the text, perhaps with AI, as I'll show you in a second, we don't want to unnecessarily do that again because it costs money and also takes longer, but this is way more efficient. And also here, where we wait 4 days before we continue, well, then the underlying serverless function, perhaps, that's where we host this on, well, now we're gonna pay for 4 days of invocation time, you may think, and actually no. So with Inngest, when we sleep like this, we don't have to keep the underlying function running. Inngest will simply run this function again after 4 days, and it can remember that we left off here, right? In fact, it will also remember the data that it got here. So it will actually sort of inject it back into the function and start off from the checkpoint where we left it. So in this case, it would continue here with the data actually that we already have from the previous step. So with step here, we get a much more sophisticated way to orchestrate this workflow. And so we don't have to worry as much about the underlying infrastructure ourselves. So let's actually try it again. I'm gonna click on summarize here. You can see the form has been reset. If I now go to my dashboard here, you can see that that one function that we still have one function. Inngest will periodically prod our server to see if there are new functions, but it's still the same function with the same name, right? So that's this function here that we set up, right? We just have a different implementation now. So now there's another run of that function. If I click on that, you can see it's still running. Why is that? Well, that is because we have that sleeping step actually, right? So it actually, you can see it per step here. So first there is the summarized text step. You can also see the output that we got from there. It will actually re-inject it back later when the sleeping is finished. Then we have this storing in a database step. We're not returning anything here. But then here you can see it's waiting 4 days. And actually, if I want, I can also manually cancel it here if I want. So this is actually amazing observability here. And we can orchestrate really sophisticated workflows very easily here with Inngest. So this function, what we just did, is more like a queuing type of system. Now, if you're just looking for cron jobs, so you want to do something periodically, like let's say every day at some time, right? So cron job, it looks very similar. So you would use ingest.create function. You give it an ID and some name. This will help it look it up in the dashboard later. And then here for cron job, you specify cron and then the actual schedule basically. And then here you have the actual implementation. So maybe we want to clean old summaries, right? Maybe if they're older than 30 days, we want to remove them from our database, let's say, right? So this is a good example of running something periodically. So you would have the actual implementation here and you would export this function here as well. And remember, Inngest is periodically checking my server side to discover new functions. So you can see now, if I go back to my dashboard here, to my functions, you can see it has picked up on that new function as well. I can see it here. And so this is also a very ergonomic way to create cron jobs in a Next.js application actually. Now, if we go back to the function that we had where we summarized the user's text, I was using step.run. Right, so it's like a checkpoint in our workflow here. It can be retried independently of the other steps and it will remember the result, and so it can inject that back later if it's necessary. They have some AI specific features here as well. So I can also use step.ai.wrap. So for example, I want to use OpenAI, let's say, to actually summarize the text. I can specify the model I want to use, and then it's very similar to how you would use the OpenAI client directly. So if I use that as the implementation to actually summarize this, now if I go to our runs here, you can see it's still in process here. If I click on that, you can see we have our run here. If I go to the OpenAI step, what we see here is actually the input, so the actual prompt that we sent along to the model, as well as the output that we got from that model. So here you can see the data that we get, and it will automatically show us the actual tokens used here as well. So the tokens that we used for the prompt, as well as the completion tokens. You typically pay for both. So the total tokens and the model that was used. So actually you have great observability here with the AI workloads that you run as well. You can see the models that were used, the prompt that was sent, the amount of tokens that were used. So if you're building an AI application, I highly recommend you check out Inngest as well. I'm using the wrap method here, but they actually take it a step further here as well with the infer method here as well. So maybe we do want to infer the sentiment, let's say, of the text that the user sent, and we want to do that with some model here as well. Previously with just wrap, we were still making that call to OpenAI and waiting for that on our own in our own app. But with infer, we can hand that off to Inngest actually. With this, Inngest will make the actual call to OpenAI and wait for that on their side. And so we don't have to run a serverless function while we're waiting for that. So while we're waiting for the response from the AI model, we don't have to run compute essentially. So Inngest can sort of pause our workflow at this point, and when there is a result from the AI model, it can continue. So this is an even more sophisticated option that we have as well. Inngest also offers a so-called AgentKit. So if you're building a highly sophisticated AI agent type of software, you definitely want to check this out. So the way it works is essentially that you create an agent. An agent can invoke tools, and we typically want to streamline the type of model that we use and some other settings as well. So we could, for example, create some kind of agent that can invoke a summarizer tool or a keyword tool or some sentiment or tone tool, and we may want to have one model for that. So you can create those tools here as well, and then you can attach them to that agent. So this makes it much more ergonomic to create an actual AI agent. You can even take it to the next level and also combine multiple agents into a network. So if you want to get very advanced and sophisticated, check out the AgentKit by Inngest as well. So I'm actually really happy to see Inngest stepping into the space, because it's really painful to set up some kind of queuing or cron jobs in Next.js. But Inngest actually fits in really nicely into the Next.js stack. Well done to the Inngest team, and I would say check them out. You can find a link in the description. They have a quick start here for Next.js, and here in Inngest Cloud, you can just log into their dashboard. You will see something very similar as what we saw locally, right? So this dashboard is what we have locally running to work with it locally. However, you can also log into their inngest.com dashboard, and then when you go to production, you can synchronize it with Inngest and you get these features as well. But if you quickly want to try it out in Next.js, I recommend that you start with the quick start here. In any case, I want to thank Inngest for sponsoring the video, and I want to thank you for watching. Hopefully it helps you out with building out your Next.js app. Have a nice day, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.